So the title for this one is called Identity and Loss. This is going to be a meditation specifically on Cuban historical photography and the profound uh, gapes and abysses that emerge through historical engagement with Cuban baseball and Cuban history at large. It's incredibly profound, and it's something that I have so enjoyed going deeper into precisely because of the level of absence that's present in Cuban baseball history. And the reason I kind of use that syntax to describe this is I'm gonna just take a closer look here at this photo. Um, there, it's the quality of the object. It is what is contained within the image, and then it is also a failure of provenance, right? And so, what I mean by a failure of provenance, here's the back of the photo. A failure of provenance means that it's a failure of documentation, a failure of organization, and thus, an image object like this represents something unknown, utterly and deeply unknown. It's an attempt to uncover and discover the true nature of history. So, for instance, let's take the player Alejandro Ohms. He got tuberculosis, I believe, at the end of the 19 teens into the 1920s. He died before the age of 50. He's one of the best Cuban baseball players of all time, known as the second greatest hitter in the Cuban leagues behind Cristobal Torriente. Um, he was called the Cuban Tycob. This photo, the difficulty here, right? I'm going to break it down. This photo supposedly contains Alejandro Ohms. It's that he's sitting second to the left here, I believe. Um, the issue with actually determining the provenance of that or the truth of that is man, multiple, multiple. I was going to say manifold, but multiple. Um, First, it's the quality of the image itself is incredibly difficult to discern with any clarity to do any sort of facial recognition, right? Whether you were going to compare this photo, his image in this photo to another photo, that's stage one. Stage two is the uniforms that are being worn. If you can see here, there's a C on the baseball cap, along with a cursive script across the chest that says Cuba with a line that comes around from the A and underlines the word. As far as I can tell, having peeled through for hours, right, hours and hours and hours of team uniform images and logos from the 19 teens and 1920s, I cannot find this specific iteration of this uniform. So there's questions. Is this a professional team? Is this an amateur team? What is the status of this organization? And furthermore, how can we tell if Ohms was involved? He played a fair bit with the Cuban Stars, um, and there is evidence in the 1920s of the Cuban Stars wearing a uniform that says Cuban Stars in script, but the uniforms are usually in block letters with a series of stars beneath the word Cuban. Um, it's very difficult to determine the actual location of this photo. You can see there's sort of like brick buildings in the background. It almost looks semi-modern. I don't know what necessarily I can make out entirely. There's some players in the background on the right and on the left. Brick buildings in the back, and then there's stands. It looks like an open area field, not necessarily a stadium. So, all right, I have to ask myself these questions: Is this an amateur team? Is this a pro team? What exactly is going on here? And I'm not given any easy answers. So look at the back, right? The amount of scrapbook residue right? And glue is obscuring the writing on the back of this. So to make this out becomes incredibly difficult. Um, and so piecing this together, you have to dig into the history and understand the trajectory of Ohms' career, right? He plays for a team that is simply called Cuba in the 1926-27 season. It was a very short-lived team. In the Winter League, he plays for them. There are two or three documents which actually confirm this online, which are archival databases, which are pulling this information and establishing it. The supreme lack of documentation of one of the greatest Cuban baseball players of all time. It always begs the question: is there something here that I'm missing? Because the historical ground is so unsure in terms of the the, the digitized documentation or information that exists, that you sort of make an appeal, right? I messaged a guy that I've been engaging with for the past couple of months named Cesar Lopez, and he's based in Miami, Florida. He's regularly working with older Cuban historians, right? And they engage and gather in groups, and that in itself is a community of knowledge that isn't necessarily being digitized into an institutional archive. He created a website called Cuban Ball, which was has since been archived. It's been taken down from official operation on the internet, and was regularly called the best English language research for Cuban English language website for Cuban baseball history. I have to contact him and say, what's going on here? Do you know? Do you have information on these uniforms? I have to look at the stirrups, right, and try to find a match and understand, as well as the hat brims being a darker color and the C on the cap. The possibility that always remains is to understand something that has not yet been institutionalized or documented or digitized in a wide way. So this gets back to what I was talking about in terms of the open area of history, which is Cuban history and Cuban baseball history. Cesar messages me, right, and he says, here's my best attempt at a timeline for Cuban baseball. And that, for me in particular, is so telling, because what he's saying is, insofar as I'm aware or I can assemble through the past decades of my research, right? He spends time hanging out with his granddaughter. This is a man who's a little further along in his lifespan, in his years. Insofar as I can discern in my decades and decades of research, here's a basic timeline, right? So we're just at the point of establishing a basic timeline from the people who are the most involved in this process of archival recovery and historical recovery. These are usually native Cubans who are very invested in baseball history. So when I'm looking at this, right, and the response that I got from my Cuban baseball history essay to have contact and to hear, right, my knowledge of actual Cuban baseball history is very minimal. It's just based on the research that I've done. But I can extrapolate that information in terms of global historical contexts, the history of civilizations, cultural theory, and cultural studies, and help create an understanding of the limited history. But that's not to say I'm discovering new historical information that's being added to the repertoire of these individuals per se. It's more of an interpretive lens to contextualize Cuban history and Cuban baseball history, as well as the history of the artifacts therein. So having contact there, right, there's this understanding, which to me is very profound, of the existing limitations of what is possible here and what is happening here, and what is actually being exhumed in real time. This is from a man named Victor's archives. I mean, he's getting these photographs. He is based in Florida. He's getting these photographs from people from Cuba. They're archives from Bohemia magazine, or They are things that have been found in scrapbooks, right? That have come to the United States, whether that's through someone who immigrated here, their archives or their collections, what have you, their grandparents' collections as photographers or members of these early teams and organizations. Um, the the ground there is as such that maybe you step in one direction or another, you're stepping on a fault line of hidden information where the bottom drops out, and there's a new historical discovery about an aspect of Alejandro Ohms's life that he played for a team that previously we didn't know very much, if anything, about. Um, and there was a certain thing that happened while he was on that team, or that team did a certain thing that redefines or shifts our aperture or lens into Cuban baseball history at large, as well as the personal and human histories that intertwine with that larger cultural narrative and construct. So this is what's so profound, but also so troublesome to me about Cuban baseball history is the it's the fragility of the existing narratives because of how they've been established and how they've been maintained, how the information has been passed down, whether that's through oral tradition or through the efforts of several individuals, groups, or organizations to sustain that history and document it. Um, I know there is a several different histories of Cuban baseball that have been written. One prominently by Raul Diaz Miro, um, that are attempts, right, continued attempts, as well as Cesar's attempt of Cuban baseball history that he's digitized to document, um, contain, and retell this story. The the issue here, though, is similar but different to the issue that's occurring in the United States, which is these are historical documentary efforts which are attempts to narrativize history as a construct and history as a timeline. I would argue here it's pretty clear objectively that the United States has a much more robust institutional archive of historical documentation, and the dialogue that is occurring in the United States, whether that's by nature of population or the institution of baseball itself in terms of uh, cultural construct, is much wider. The aperture is much wider. It's being covered from many more different angles, and as such, the archives are more robust. So, if I was to enter into dialogue with any given part of American baseball history, obviously, the earlier on you go, the more difficult it is to understand or discern that information. But this is ground that has been well tread and well covered, not only in terms of the timelines of the occurrences in American baseball, but the way in which those occurrences are being interpreted from various different perspectives. So, with Cuban baseball history, we don't even have that. We have a very limited understanding of what even happened. So when you get to a certain point, which is pre 1900, even getting a basic depiction of one of the most important historical figures in baseball history becomes incredibly difficult in Cuba. The same as we discussed in the previous episode with Jose Mendez or Alejandro Ohms, even getting a basic picture of the personal life and personal history of these individuals is incredibly difficult and complex. And you end up missing absolutely crucial details to even form a basic aperture on the surface of what's happening and what's going on. So when you get any deeper in terms of added layers of complexity, let's say, did the Cuban Stars team wear different uniforms when they went to Mexico or the United States or wherever they went to barnstorm or play exhibitions or competitions? Um, Furthermore, did Alejandro Ohms play for an iteration of a Cuban barnstorming team that isn't already in the archive? The question is so it just resounds in an emptiness. It's an echo that can't necessarily be answered. Um, Peeling and peeling and peeling through these archives and these databases of photographs, there's already very little. Pre 1930, in terms of Cuban baseball history, there's already very, very, very little. So you're already working with such a small, digitized archival database of information that I'm circling through the same photos over and over again. and I'm thinking to myself, okay, where am I going to have the breakthrough, right? Where am I going to get that information that's going to springboard me into a real awareness of what's happening here? And the breakthrough just isn't happening, right? Because there's so little information to access. Even in terms of researching Alejandro Ohms, the specific season, Cuba, the team, it's just the name Cuba. 1926 to 1927, the winter season, I can find online 2 documents that tell the league leaders for those seasons. It's from a Negro Leagues and Cuban Leagues historical database that has just created basically a PDF archive of this high level data, high level information. And what I'm able to get from that is just names that were on those teams and their statistics, which is, all things considered, it's a great level of information, but it shows just what we're working with here in terms of digitized database archival information that's readily and easily accessible to the average person. If you don't have access to this in group of older Cuban historians that may gather, whether it's in Florida or in Cuba, to discuss this game, right, and the history of the game. Let's say maybe you did. Even in that case, right, there still may be this, we just don't know, right? Between us and our oral history and the transmission of the oral history, we just don't know. But that's a very, very limited group of people. And Cesar himself only gained access by coincidence, by meeting a shop owner who showed him an archive of old baseball cards and photos, and the mutual interest was established, and then he ended up meeting this in-group of Cuban baseball historians. Even with that information, you're still left with the very, very high possibility that people just do not know. So the basics are essentially established. There's the 3 major teams early on that expand slightly. There's financial difficulties. You have the integration in 1900, and you have details and events and occurrences. You have to always wonder in a situation like this, and this is what's so fascinating about examining the Cuban baseball history. I'm always just wondering to myself, is there something here that I'm missing, or is there something here that's not already documented in the historical agreed upon consensus timeline of how this history unfolds, even at a surface level? Because if I don't have that, my vantage is compromised. I'm working off of information which is speculative, just the same as I'm speculating on this photo and trying to discern, is that even Alejandro Ohms? And if so, what's missing in the historical record? Is this a team that he played for that hasn't necessarily been documented yet? Maybe it was a briefly assembled barnstorming team or a briefly assembled competition team in the 1920s, let's say, for instance. Or these are alternate jerseys that whether it was the Cuban Stars or Cuba, the team itself from 26 and 27, used for a competition. When I look up these jerseys, every once in a while I'll see one thing. It's the Cuban Stars logo slightly altered in this kind of script, and I'm like, okay, that's a clue. But then there's also the Cuba team itself, and I have maybe 2 pictures of the Cuba team itself's jerseys, and they don't look like this. And then I'm wondering, okay, is this just another iteration of the Cuba team itself's jerseys? So I have to do some sort of combination of facial recognition, uniform identification, try to discern where exactly that this photograph is located based on limited information, and there's 0 provenance on the back of the photo itself. And this to me is so representative of the condition of Cuban baseball history at large. Because let's say for your average person, if you aren't already in that in-group of native Cuban historians, or maybe even if you are, right, who's to say here, the way that you're approaching Cuban baseball history is almost like feeling your way around in the dark, so to speak, because the records that have been kept and the records that are accessible in terms of how documentary they are, even beyond statistics and rosters. The real sort of player biographies, the richness of what's going on behind the scenes, is something that is still very much uh, difficult to discern unless you were to, let's say, interview one of the ancestral members of Alejandro Oms's family or Jose Mendez's family. And even then, right, who is to say that that kind of personal human historical information has been preserved? So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. Um, it's just very interesting to look at this information and these artifacts, and try to cultivate a level of understanding, especially when there is no explicit knowledge layer to hang on to. Let's say I could immediately identify these uniforms or identify several of the players indisputably because the quality of the photo was very high. I could do a basic facial recognition match and say, hey, I know exactly who that is. I could run that person's name through what teams they played for in their team history and do the uniform match, right? And understand, okay, this was the team that they played for and these were the years they played. And then try to identify one more player and complete that roster, so to speak, and say, okay, these two players played together for these 2 years, and then maybe find one more player, right? Something like that, to try to narrow down the results and create at least a foundational understanding of who this is, who this group of people is. And so when you don't have that knowledge and you're in that level of unknown, it's fascinating, right? Because this goes back again to the title of this essay here, identity and loss, because the unmoored aspect of this history is that a lot of the time you're dealing with something that you're trying to access or trying to know, but again, there's this opacity, and the opacity is there's no archival or digitized information, no sort of compilation of footage or photos that's going to allow you to create like like a relational capacity to create context, right? Context as a bridge, or relational space as a relative space between two phenomena or two objects or two images or two people. Um, when you don't have that, and you're kind of floating in space at this level of, I don't know what team this is. I can't confirm necessarily any one of these players' identities, because whether the image quality of the photo is difficult to truly do a one-to-one. I don't have the ability to use provenance on the back of the photo, whether that's just a couple letters that have been scribbled down or a pasted press release or press text. Um, that lack of ability to create context um, leaves you floating in this void of possibilities. Um, so I'm currently just trying to discern this, right, and reaching out to different people I have contacts with to say, hey, do you understand this? Do you know what team this is? Is this an alternate uniform, like a variation of a uniform? Um, can you confirm that that's Alejandro Ohms? Um, do you know exactly when this was? Do you know what it was for? Um, there's all of these questions that emerge from a historical document like this, and it's so intriguing and tantalizing because of this unknown factor. There's not even a single element of this I've been able to identify with any level of certainty. So it leaves this space of possibilities. I'm going to do a little more work in terms of the attempt to identify certain figures in the image itself. Um, but without that ability, you really are working with a limitation, a pretty significant limitation. And I think that's described to a degree the powerful and difficult experience of Cuban baseball history, in my experience of it from the outside looking in. Because you can see how this relates to identity, right? Like, let's say there was someone who was in Alejandro Ohms' family who was attempting to recover the narrative past of Alejandro Holmes. This could very well be something that reveals another aspect of his history which cannot be found in the most sophisticated documentation of his life, whether that's a player biography, whether that's personal information that's been passed down through the family. Um, and so that level of historical recovery is so present with Cuban baseball history, because when I'm working with American baseball history, or when I'm working with something that's more modern or has been more institutionalized, the historical ground is already laid, so extrapolation is much more possible. Forming relational context is much more possible. Working with different eras and epochs of history and doing a comparative analysis is much more possible. Here, we are still in the place of this could be something that does not even yet exist in the common or even the esoteric understanding of Cuban baseball history. And so something that was recovered in the attic of a family of a photojournalist that survived um, Cuban uprising in the mid-century, the Cuban Revolution in the mid-century, um, without context, and it wasn't communicated what this was or what any of these artifacts were. Something like that could actually be a breakthrough understanding in the larger collective conceptualization of Cuban baseball history itself. And that itself could be a fundamental or foundational discovery. Um, and that's not something that's incredibly common, and it has a lot to do with the current state of the historical narrative as it has been um, nailed down or made clear. Um, and this, again, has a lot to do with how Cuban baseball history has been marginalized, how it has been left to Cuban baseball historians, how it has been um, misunderstood or just totally not understood internationally in terms of its real importance in the grand scheme of baseball history. So it's it is, again, right, it is this recovery project of history to, one, right, to establish just how important Cuban baseball history is, and then two, to make sure that those stones are laid as a collective effort or endeavor to preserve that history as best as possible. Um, right, because that's what allows for people to enter into the sort of room of history that is Cuban baseball, and to commune with it and listen to it and attempt to understand it and relate it to the entire greater multicultural movement of baseball at large. Um, that kind of understanding reverberates through the nation of Cuba. It reverberates internationally, but it also comes down the chain into um, specific cultural movements within Cuban baseball history, and then furthermore, the human, personal, ancestral movements that occur within Cuban baseball history, within team contexts. Again, right? It's a sort of nesting doll effect of history that you're sort of turning the locks to in a way that you're reach searching through the dark to uncover and illuminate as best as possible in order to create that fertile ground of culture that is preservation, that is the respect and the act of preservation. So there it is. Good to talk to y'all. I will catch you on the next one.